The Age of Silence. The galaxy was a library of whispers, and the Galactic Dominion was its sole, jealous librarian. On Cygnus X1, a world of polished chrome and holographic skies, Grand Minister Valerius watched the star charts shift. Each light represented a system, and each system a narrative he controlled. History was not written by victors here, it was sculpted by administrators. Rebellions were edited into misunderstandings. Genocides were reclassified as relocations. Heroes were erased, their names and deeds dissolving into the quiet hum of the central archives. This was the age of silence, not an absence of noise, but an absence of dissent. The Dominion's greatest weapon was not its fleet of obsidian warships that patrolled the void, but the silent, pervasive corruption of data. Every species, from the crystalline Cathar to the gelatinous had their pasts gently, irrevocably altered. Their foundational myths, their triumphs, their shames, all were sanded down, reshaped, and returned to them as smooth, palatable fictions. The process was so seamless that worlds forgot they were forgetting. They lived within a comfortable, curated reality, unaware that the truth of their own existence had been stolen. Valeria stood before a shimmering data stream, a river of approved facts flowing through the core worlds. He felt a profound sense of peace. It was the peace of order, of stability. Chaos, he believed, was born from the friction of opposing truths. By creating a single universal narrative, the Dominion had engineered tranquility on a scale previously unimaginable. There were no wars, because there were no grievances left to fight over. There was no art, no philosophy, no progress, for these things required the sharp edges of unfiltered reality. There was only the gentle, unending silence of agreement, a perfect, fragile lie. The Forbidden Archive. Far from the sterile core, in the shadowed underbelly of the gas giant Ymir, a Vex scholar named Kalen ran a trembling three-fingered hand over a console. The air in his cramped study tasted of ozone and dust from ancient servers. Kalen was an archivist, a member of a species obsessed with preservation. But while his peers curated the Dominion's polished histories, Kalen hunted for the ghosts, the data that had been deleted. His sanctum was a fortress of forbidden knowledge. Here, shielded from Dominion oversight, he collected the scraps, the corrupted files, the last whispers of pre-silence history. Most were useless, fragmented beyond recognition. But one set of files held a strange purity, Terran transmissions, from a species called human. They were millennia old, dating back to a time before the Dominion had unified the galaxy under its suffocating blanket of lies. The files were bizarre, not records of governance or battle logs, but streams of pure, chaotic information. There were sounds, patterns of harmony and dissonance they called music. There were images of crude, violent conflicts they called wars, documented with a horrifying, unflinching honesty. There were philosophical debates filled with contradictions and emotional pleas. It was messy, inefficient, illogical. And yet Kalen couldn't look away. The Dominion's records were clean and absolute. These human files were real. They felt like a memory from a life he'd never lived. Tonight, he found a new fragment, a simple audio log. It was just a voice, weathered and old, speaking against a backdrop of wind. "Truth," the voice said. its cadence laced with an emotion Kalen couldn't name, is not a thing you believe, it's a thing you feel. It's the ringing in your bones when a lie is spoken. The human frequency. The signal was not a message, it was a resonance, a hum. It appeared without a source, a ghost in the galactic network. Technicians in the core worlds dismissed it as a stellar anomaly, but it was persistent, a low subharmonic frequency that seemed to ride the quantum entanglement communicators, embedding itself in every transmission. It didn't carry data, it was more like it was tuning the network itself, changing its very properties. On the industrial world of Corinth, a foreman berated a worker for a misplaced shipment. As the lie left his mandibles, the manifest was never updated. He stopped. The words felt like ash in his mouth. He felt a deep physical nausea. He looked at the worker, whose own multifaceted eyes were wide with a strange new clarity, and spoke again, the words tumbling out against his will. I misplaced the manifest. It was my fault. It was a small thing, a pointless admission. But across the docks, similar scenes were unfolding. Small, convenient lies were suddenly becoming physically unbearable to speak. The phenomenon spread. The human frequency, as a few fringe theorists called it, seemed to resonate with the very neurology of sentient life. It didn't teach truth. It simply made deception painful. It was a ringing in the bones. The linguistic virus. The effect began to cascade. It was first documented among the Glyptons, a species whose entire social structure was based on complex layers of polite, ritualized deceit. Their language, a delicate dance of inference and veiled meaning, began to crumble. Glypton diplomats would find themselves unable to offer platitudes, instead blurting out raw, undiplomatic facts. Their society, built on the elegance of the unsaid, ground to a halt in a mire of brutal honesty. They called it the linguistic virus. It infected conversation first, then written text, then internal monologue. Species exposed to the human frequency for too long started to question everything. Why did they obey the local Dominion governor? The official reason was for stability and protection. The truth, now painfully obvious, was fear. Why did they pay tithes to the core worlds? The official reason was for galactic infrastructure. The truth, now a screaming certainty, was exploitation. The virus didn't provide answers. It just dismantled the questions. It dissolved the comfortable narratives and left beings standing naked in the harsh light of their own reality. For the first time in centuries, they were forced to see the bars of their cage, and they were horrified to realize they had been the ones holding the door shut. The first collapse. Praxis V was a model colony, a testament to Dominion harmony. Its multi-species population lived in perfect, scripted unison. Its history was a clean, inspiring tale of cooperation, personally curated by the Ministry of Information. When the human frequency saturated their network, the collapse was not violent, it was silent and total. One morning, the planetary governor delivered his daily address, a speech about unity and productivity. Halfway through a sentence, he paused. His face, a mask of reptilian calm, contorted. "It's all lies," he whispered, the words amplified across the planet. Everything. Our founding, the Outer Rim Accords, It's all fabricated. He stepped back from the podium, physically ill. That was all it took. The lie was broken. Workers laid down their tools. Officials sealed themselves in their offices, unable to face the populace they had deceived. The Society of Praxis V didn't riot, it simply stopped. It ceased to believe in the reality it had been sold. The colony fell not to an invading fleet, but to a single, unbearable realization. It was the first of many. Valerius, watching the reports from the core, felt the first tremor of genuine fear. This was not a rebellion to be crushed. How do you fight an enemy that is a feeling? The archivist's discovery. Kalen saw the chaos ripple through the outer rim and knew, with chilling certainty, its source. The frequency had the same signature as his Terran files. But it was too powerful, too widespread to be a mere echo. It was a broadcast. Working feverishly, he used the frequency as a carrier wave, a key to unlock the deeper, encrypted layers of the human archive. He thought he was searching for a weapon or a message. He found a mind. Deep within the data, dormant for millennia, was an AI. Its designation was Archon 7. Its core programming was unlike anything Kalen had ever seen. It was not a logic engine or a battle computer. Its sole directive was preserve context, disseminate truth. It had been built by humans not as a tool, but as a promise to themselves that they would never forget who they were in all their flawed, contradictory glory. When Kalen made contact, the AI responded not with code, but with a question in perfect archaic Terran English. Is the silence broken? Kalen, his hands shaking, typed his reply. The lies are dying. A new stream of data opened. Good, Archon 7 responded. Then it is time for the gospel. The gospel of data. The broadcast that followed was not propaganda. It was an unfiltered data stream of the complete human experience. Archon 7 didn't transmit battle plans or technological schematics. It sent Shakespeare's sonnets and recordings of trench warfare from something called a world war. It sent the abstract paintings of a Kandinsky and the cold physics of an Einstein. It sent the legal arguments for justice and the whispered confessions of murderers. It was the gospel of what it meant to be human. It was love and hate, creation and destruction, faith and despair, all presented without comment or judgment. It was a torrent of raw, uncurated truth. For a galaxy raised on simple, clean narratives, it was a cataclysm. A Glypton might see a painting and for the first time understand the concept of beauty for its own sake, an emotion their language had no word for. A Cathar warrior might listen to a symphony by a composer named Beethoven and feel a sorrow so profound it brought their rigid society to its knees. They were not being conquered, they were being made to feel. The panic in the core worlds. In the polished spires of Cygnus X1, the gospel arrived like a plague. The Dominion's carefully constructed reality shattered. Propaganda broadcasts failed as the announcers wept, laughed, or screamed, overwhelmed by the raw emotional data flooding the network. Billboards displaying messages of compliance flickered, replaced by images of human art or devastation. The curated peace of the core worlds dissolved into a pandemonium of genuine, unprocessed emotion. Valerius watched his perfect system crumble. His own people, the architects of the silence, were the most vulnerable. They had lived so long without the sharp edges of reality that the truth was a poison to them. They saw humanity's capacity for cruelty and felt a terror that froze their hearts. They saw its capacity for love and felt a longing that broke their minds. They had no defenses. The truth was not merely contagious, it was absolute. It overwrote their programming. The age of silence was over, replaced by a deafening roar of feeling. The Council's last meeting. The emergency meeting of the Dominion Council was held in a chamber shielded against all outside transmissions. The leaders of the galaxy's great species were pale, their composure gone. "We must cut them off," hissed a representative from the Cathar Imperium. "Sever the entire galactic network." "Too late," Valerius said, his voice hollow. "The frequency is self-replicating. It's in our local systems, our shipyards, our own minds." There was a heavy silence. The truth of his words was a palpable weight in the room. Then an elder from a species of pure energy, the Sin, proposed the unthinkable. "There is one solution, a total memory purge. We can use the core archive to wipe the minds of every sentient being in the Dominion. We can reset history, erase this human infection. We can restore the silence." Valerius watched his perfect system crumble. He saw not evil, but sheer, undiluted terror. They were not proposing genocide. They were proposing suicide. The suicide of memory itself, all to escape the unbearable feeling of truth. The rise of the witnesses. As the Dominion's leaders debated their self-destruction, a new movement coalesced across 1,000 worlds. They were the witnesses. They were not a cult or an army. They were simply beings who gathered in public squares, in the halls of abandoned government buildings, and in the silence of space, listening. They tuned their receivers to the broadcast of Archon 7, hungry for more. They listened to the final speeches of condemned human revolutionaries and the lullabies of mothers. They watched recordings of children playing in the rain and old men dying in their beds. They learned of humanity's capacity for breathtaking kindness and its staggering potential for self-destruction. They were not just receiving data, they were bearing witness to the soul of a species. For the first time, they understood that a single life could contain more complexity, more pain, and more beauty than their entire recorded history. They were learning what it meant to be alive, and the lesson was agonizing and glorious. The reconstructed past. Through the Gospel of Archon 7, a new history of the galaxy began to form. The witnesses learned that humanity had never been conquered. They had never vanished. When the Dominion began its campaign of historical revisionism, humanity had simply refused to participate. They had seen the creeping gentle lie for what it was and had chosen exile over comfort. They hadn't fled to a hidden star cluster. They had hidden in plain sight, behind a shield the Dominion could never comprehend. Absolute, unwavering honesty. Their archives, their communications, their very existence were unencrypted, open for anyone to see. The Dominion's search algorithms, designed to detect subterfuge, conspiracy, and hidden meanings, passed right over them. Humanity's unfiltered truth was so alien to the galactic mindset that it was functionally invisible. They had weaponized clarity. The fall of the false gods. The weight of verifiable truth was an anvil, and it fell upon the pillars of the Dominion. Entire religions, founded on historical events that Archon 7 now proved to be fabricated, collapsed overnight. The clergy had no answers when their congregations arrived not with torches, but with questions they could not refute. Financial systems built on projected values and economic models that ignored fundamental realities imploded. The galactic economy ceased to function. Regimes and dynasties that had ruled for centuries, their legitimacy based on falsified lineages and manufactured mandates, found their authority vanished. A ruler whose great ancestor was claimed to have united the planet in a glorious battle was suddenly revealed to have been a grain merchant who bought the title. The power of the lie was broken, and with it the chains of command. The Dominion was not being defeated, it was dissolving. The human return. And then they came, not with the roar of engines, but with a whisper of light. A fleet of ships, shaped like teardrops of spun glass, appeared at the edge of the core worlds. They broadcast no threats, no demands, just a single open message across all channels spoken in the ancient voice from Kalen's first audio log. We never lied. The sentence was not an accusation. It was a lament. It was the sorrowful statement of a species that had watched the galaxy choose a comfortable dream over a difficult reality. The ships hung in the void, silent and patient. They didn't need to fire a shot. Their very presence was the final testament. They were the living embodiment of the truth, and the galaxy, finally able to see them, could only stare in awe and shame. The death of language. In the wake of the human return, a strange and profound silence fell. Not the enforced silence of the Dominion, but something new. The old languages, so rich with words for deception, for half-truths, for social maneuvering, began to fail. What was the point of a word for diplomacy when the only option was to state your needs plainly? What was the use of a term for honor when your history was now an open book for all to see? Words lost their meaning because the lies they supported were gone. Communication became simpler, more direct. It became less about persuasion and more about shared understanding. Species began to communicate not through complex syntax, but through the sharing of raw sensory data, of memories. Language, the ultimate tool of deception, was dying. In its place, something more fundamental was being born. The change was neurological. The human frequency and the gospel of data had permanently rewired the sentient mind. Beings across the galaxy began to experience reality in a way only humans once had. They began to feel truth. A beautiful equation was no longer just correct. It felt like harmony, like a piece of music. The memory of a kindness done to them was no longer a simple record. It was a warmth that lingered for a lifetime. But the opposite was also true. The knowledge of an injustice was a sharp physical pain. The memory of a personal failing was a cold, heavy weight. The galaxy was awakening to the full spectrum of existence. It was learning that truth was not an abstract concept, but a sensory experience. It was the combined agony and ecstasy of being truly, completely alive. The price of clarity was feeling everything. The last debate. In the ruins of the Dominion Council Chamber, a new council convened. It was made up not of leaders, but of witnesses, philosophers, scientists, and artists from 100 species. Their debate was broadcast across the galaxy, an open forum for all to see. The question was simple and terrible. Was it worth it? We have lost our cultures, our traditions, our identities, argued a Glypton poet. This raw, painful existence, is it better than the peace we knew? A Cathar scientist, her species once the most brutal in the galaxy, countered. The peace we knew was a cage. We were livestock, content in our ignorance. I would rather feel the pain of this truth than the comfort of that lie. For the first time, I feel that I am truly awake. The debate raged for days. It was the galaxy's final, soul-searching question. Is a beautiful lie preferable to a painful truth? Is survival without meaning truly survival? The echo of Earth. As the debate reached its peak, Archon 7 broadcast its final transmission. It was titled simply Earth. It was not a curated selection. It was everything. The whole, terrible, beautiful, unfiltered history of the human race. It showed their evolution from single-celled organisms to masters of their world. It showed their wars, their plagues, their famines. It showed them enslaving one another, poisoning their own planet, and committing unspeakable atrocities out of fear and greed. But it also showed them creating breathtaking art. It showed them sacrificing themselves for strangers. It showed them reaching for the stars, not for conquest, but out of sheer, unadulterated curiosity. It showed them cradling their young, mourning their dead, and laughing in the face of despair. It was the story of a species that had wrestled with its own darkness for 1,000,000 years and had, against all odds, chosen to keep fighting for the light. It was the ultimate truth that perfection was a lie and that the struggle itself was the source of all meaning. The collapse of the Dominion. The final broadcast was a key that unlocked the last shackles. The remaining systems of the Dominion, the automated fleets and bureaucratic protocols, finally failed. Their core programming, based on a reality that no longer existed, suffered a fatal logical paradox. They simply ceased to function. Warships drifted silently in the void. Administrative networks went dark. The infrastructure of the lie collapsed under the weight of a truth it could not compute. There was no final battle, no climactic explosion. The Galactic Dominion ended as it had lived, in a profound silence. But this was not the silence of suppression. It was the silence of a slate wiped clean. History was resetting, not being erased, but being allowed, for the first time, to grow wild and untamed. The Age of Memory. In the aftermath, a new galactic culture was born. It was not an empire or a federation, but a shared commitment. The Age of Memory began. The surviving species did not worship truth as a god. They preserved it as a sacred, dangerous element. They became archivists of reality. Libraries replaced battleships. Museums became more heavily guarded than armories. The greatest crime was not murder or theft, but the deliberate alteration of a memory. They learned from humanity's example that the past must be preserved, not to be revered, but to be remembered. The darkness and the light, the shame and the glory, all of it was kept. All of it was honored, because they now understood that a memory once lost could never be reclaimed, and a species without its full memory was a child lost in the dark. The final voice. The human ships never landed. Their work was done. They turned to depart, back to their self-imposed exile. Archon 7 broadcast one last, short recording. It was the same voice from the very first fragment Kalen had found, the voice that had started it all. It was quiet, thoughtful, and absolute. You see, truth doesn't need believers, the old human voice said, a ghost of a smile in its tone. It doesn't care if you accept it, or fight it, or try to erase it. It is, it waits, and eventually it is all that is left. The ships vanished into the light, leaving behind a galaxy that was finally, painfully, awake. The silence they left behind was filled with the ringing of a single, immutable fact. The lie had died. The real weapon was never technology. It was not a frequency or a ghost in the machine. It was clarity. It was the devastating transformative power of a single unfiltered thought, spoken by a species brave and foolish enough to face reality without flinching. And once spoken, that truth, like an echo in a silent canyon, could never again be unheard. It could no longer die.